Maya stared at the rent notice as if it were a wound cut into her chest. The red letters glared back at her, reminding her of what she already knew. Time was slipping away and the roof over their heads was at risk. She folded the paper, tucked it under a stack of unopened bills, and sat at the edge of the bed, feeling her pulse drum in her ears. Ethan was still at work, his late shift swallowing more of him each day, and though she wanted to wait for him, she also knew the conversation would only spiral into frustration. Their marriage had become a place where silence was safer than honesty. She had tried to keep up with everything. Her hours at the small cafe were never enough, and side hustles had failed one after another. She even listed some of her jewelry online, but the offers were laughable, a reminder of how little her efforts mattered against the weight of debt. Each call she made to a friend ended with apologies. Each option she searched left her more hollow. Every passing day turned her stomach tighter. When Ethan came home that evening, she tried to bring up the rent, her voice tentative, testing the waters of his patience. He sighed, shoulders slumped, and muttered that he was exhausted, that they would find a way somehow, but he had nothing tangible to offer. He kissed her forehead in a distracted way, already thinking about tomorrow's work, and she stood there in silence, a pit forming in her chest. He had no idea how urgent it was, no idea eviction was looming like a storm ready to break. She lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. It wasn't just about money, it was about the way she felt invisible, carrying a burden alone while the man she loved drifted further from her. Her body ached for comfort, yet her heart told her she would find none here. The following afternoon, she knocked on Mr. Dalton's office door, a bundle of nerves inside her chest. He greeted her warmly, too warmly, with the kind of charm that set her on edge. She explained her situation, the words tumbling out with more desperation than she wanted to reveal. His expression softened, though there was something in his eyes that unsettled her. "Maya, I like having you here," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're a good tenant. It would be a shame to see you leave over something like this." He let the silence stretch, then lowered his voice. "There are other ways you could make it up to me." The suggestion landed like ice water on her skin. She froze, eyes narrowing in disbelief, certain she had misheard him. But his gaze didn't waver. His tone was smooth, calculated, dripping with an unspoken threat cloaked as generosity. Her stomach twisted, a cocktail of rage, shame, and fear flooding through her. She stood, stammering, trying to find words, but none seemed to fit. He didn't push further, only gave her a small, knowing smile, as though he'd planted a seed he was certain would grow. Walking back home, her mind raced. She wanted to scream, to tell Ethan everything, to tear up the notice and pretend it didn't matter. But beneath the fury was something darker, a whisper reminding her of the eviction notice, of the reality she couldn't escape. She imagined the bags packed at the door, the shame of asking family for shelter, the sight of Ethan's disappointment when he realized she had failed them. She told herself she would never consider such an offer, never stoop that low. Yet when she passed the corner where she once dreamed of opening a small boutique, the thought stung. Dreams cost money, and survival demanded choices she never wanted to make. That evening, Ethan returned home, too drained to notice the storm brewing inside her. He barely listened when she tried again to bring up their situation, brushing it off with a weary smile. "We'll manage," he repeated, the phrase hollow, meaningless. He kissed her cheek absent-mindedly and turned to his phone. She watched him, a stranger in her own home, wondering how love could feel so distant while desperation sat beside her like a shadow. She pulled the eviction notice from the drawer after he fell asleep and held it under the dim kitchen light. The paper trembled in her hands as if it were alive. The date was a deadline carved into her mind, a countdown she couldn't escape. She whispered to herself that something had to give, that she would find another way. But the echo of Mr. Dalton's words lingered, insidious, reminding her that choices don't always come dressed in dignity. By the time dawn broke, she felt smaller than she had ever felt, torn between pride and survival, loyalty and necessity. She looked at Ethan, asleep and oblivious, and wondered what kind of woman she would become if she gave in to the landlord's offer, or what kind of woman she would be if she didn't and lost everything anyway. Word count 767. White heavy check mark. Do you want me to continue with section 2? 760 words, in the same style right away. Maya's nights became longer, the weight of what had been said pressing on her chest until sleep was impossible. She turned from side to side, listening to Ethan's steady breathing, envying his ability to rest while her thoughts tore her apart. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the eviction date looming like a noose, and Mr. Dalton's voice returned to her, smooth and heavy, reminding her she had an option she didn't dare admit aloud. She tried to fight it. The next morning she filled out more applications online, hunting for part-time work she could fit between her cafe shifts. She called an old acquaintance, humiliated as she explained her situation, only to hear apologies and excuses in return. She even opened her jewelry box again, considering the ring Ethan had given her on their anniversary, but her hands trembled at the thought of selling something tied to their vows. Each attempt left her more exhausted, more defeated. Ethan remained blind to the storm. He came home with tired eyes and distracted words, speaking about deadlines and coworkers but never once asking how she was managing the pressure. When she brought up the rent again, her voice cracked with the urgency she could no longer mask. He brushed her off with the same line, "We'll manage," but gave no answers, no plan. His faith in the future was hollow, and Maya felt abandoned in the present. She wanted to scream at him, to shake him until he saw how desperate she was, but the words stayed trapped in her throat. Instead, she smiled weakly, nodding, hiding her resentment as he drifted off toward bed. It was easier to let him believe things were fine than to reveal the depth of her fear. Still, that silence dug into her, convincing her she was alone in a marriage that had once been her sanctuary. Mr. Dalton was never far from her thoughts. His offer lingered like poison, but also like a lifeline. She hated herself for even entertaining the thought, yet the more doors that closed in her face, the louder that one opened in her mind. Each time she remembered his expression, calm and confident, she felt cornered by the inevitability of it all. Days slipped away. The notice remained pinned to the refrigerator, a constant reminder of how little time she had left. One night, after another argument that went nowhere, she sat alone in the dark kitchen, staring at the paper until tears blurred the words. She tried to imagine what it would be like to tell Ethan the truth, that she had failed, that they were going to lose their home. She imagined the disappointment in his eyes, the bitterness that would creep into his voice, and she crumbled under the weight of it. She told herself survival wasn't betrayal. She told herself it would only be one time, something she could bury deep enough that it would never surface. She told herself Ethan didn't need to know, that protecting him from the truth was an act of love, not of deception. Lies became comfort, each one stitched together into a fragile justification she clung to. When she finally agreed, her body moved as though it no longer belonged to her. Every step was heavy, every word she spoke to Mr. Dalton coated in shame. He looked at her with a satisfaction that made her stomach twist, as though he had been waiting for this moment, certain she would fold. She felt her dignity slipping away, each breath caught between fear and surrender. The act itself was not passion, nor intimacy, but transaction. She kept her eyes closed at times, imagining herself somewhere else, with someone else, anyone but him. Yet she could not escape the reality of what she was doing. Every second carved into her like a scar she knew would never fade. The price of rent had become more than money, it had become her body, her trust, her vows. When it was over, she felt hollow, a shell of who she had been. He handed her relief in the form of assurance, no eviction, no overdue notice, everything handled. His voice carried triumph, while hers carried silence. She left without looking back, terrified that if she did, the weight of her choice would crush her before she reached the door. Back home, she washed her face until her skin burned, but the feeling would not leave her. She sat in the bathroom with the water running, hoping the sound would drown out the guilt screaming inside her. Ethan knocked lightly, asking if she was okay, and she forced a calm tone, hiding everything. When she came out, she smiled weakly and wrapped her arms around him, holding on longer than usual, as though clinging to what little innocence remained. He kissed her cheek, unaware, his trust untouched, and she hated herself for the relief that washed over her. The rent was no longer a threat, but in its place stood something far more dangerous, the secret of what she had done. And though Ethan held her as though nothing had changed, Maya knew everything had. Word count, 764 white heavy check mark. Do you want me to go ahead and craft section 3, 760 war? In the same style right away, aftermath and truth, in the same style now. The days after were the hardest, because silence had become her prison. Maya moved through the apartment as if she were both present and absent, performing her routines but feeling detached from herself. Every glance from Ethan seemed to pierce her, every casual word a reminder that she was hiding something monumental behind her lips. She tried to convince herself that what she had done was for both of them, that it was an act of sacrifice to protect their home, but the thought offered no comfort. Instead, it twisted her further, because if it had truly been for him, why did she feel so unclean when he reached for her hand? Ethan noticed the change, though he didn't understand it. He asked why she seemed distant, why she avoided his eyes, why she touched him as though she were afraid of burning him. She offered excuses, exhaustion, headaches, the stress of bills, but none satisfied him. He pressed gently, not yet suspecting the truth, and each question deepened her guilt until it sat in her chest like a stone. She wanted to confess, but the fear of losing him froze her tongue. Mr. Dalton had not disappeared either. Though the rent issue was settled, he made sure she knew that the door remained open. He spoke with casual assurance when she saw him in passing, dropping subtle reminders that if she ever found herself short again, he would be willing to work something out. His smirk carried the weight of ownership, and it sickened her. Maya realized then that it hadn't been a single decision, it was a trap, one she had stepped into willingly, and the consequences could stretch far beyond that one night. Her shame seeped into every moment of her marriage. When Ethan laughed at something on his phone, she envied his innocence, knowing she had shattered the trust he placed in her. When he kissed her, she stiffened, terrified he would taste betrayal on her lips. When he held her in bed, her tears stained the pillow in silence, and he never noticed. She lived in two worlds now, the world he believed in, where they were still partners fighting life together, and the darker reality where she had crossed a line she could never uncross. The breaking point came when Ethan found the old notice crumpled at the bottom of the drawer. He asked why she had hidden it, why she hadn't told him how close they had been to losing everything. His voice was sharp with hurt, and his eyes demanded answers she couldn't give. She stammered, lied about finding a way to fix it, but his suspicion grew. His gaze narrowed as he studied her, and she knew that if she didn't speak then, the lie would consume her entirely. Tears came before the words. She broke, sobbing, choking on the confession that tore itself out of her throat. She told him she hadn't known what else to do, that she had been terrified of losing their home, that she had made a choice she never wanted to make. Ethan's face went pale as the meaning sank in, his silence more painful than if he had shouted. When his voice finally came, it was cold, trembling with anger and disbelief. He asked how she could do this, how she could betray everything they had built. Maya dropped to her knees, begging, trying to explain that it wasn't about desire, that it wasn't about replacing him, but about survival. Her words fell flat, swallowed by the enormity of what she had admitted. Ethan turned away, his hands gripping his hair as though he could pull the truth out of his mind. He didn't look at her, and that absence of his gaze cut deeper than any accusation. The silence that followed was suffocating. They sat in the same room, worlds apart, the space between them filled with everything unsaid. Ethan finally told her he needed time, that he couldn't even look at her without seeing the betrayal, and he walked out. The sound of the door closing echoed through the apartment like a final judgment. Maya stayed on the floor long after, shaking, feeling as if the air had left the room. She thought about the chain of choices that had led her here, the lack of money, the lack of communication, the lack of support, and how quickly desperation had turned her into someone she no longer recognized. She wanted to believe that Ethan might forgive her one day, but she also knew that forgiveness would not erase what had been done. In the stillness, she understood that her survival had cost more than she could have imagined. She had saved their home, but she had lost the foundation of her marriage. She had chosen a path that could never be undone, a secret that had become truth, and in revealing it, she had shattered the very thing she had hoped to protect. Nothing would ever be the same, because once trust is broken, love can no longer rest on the same ground. She sat in the darkness, realizing the cruelest truth of all, that in saving their roof, she may have destroyed their home. Word count 765 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to now compile all 3 sections into one continuous 2,000-word story for smooth narration flow?